Hey, good to see y'all this evening. It's quite a crowd here. Like Edward was saying, I grew up in Greene County, and we do our business and went to school in Pickens County, and so very at home, and Pickens County a part of me too. About 15 years ago, I got real interested in the Civil War in Pickens County, and we're really in the general area. And I began reading a lot of most of the stuff written in the 20th century about the Federal Brigade that after it burned the University of Alabama came through the area, and where a lot of the writers that wrote about this speculated that the fighting had taken place, and I began to look at the maps, and I did check the road distances, and it just really didn't quite add up the way there's basically two books that are written about that. One's called Croxton's Raid about Rex Miller, and Mr. Miller, Dr. Miller was I don't think he ever set foot in Alabama. I corresponded with him a good bit, but he researched General Croxton a great deal, and had written several other articles on that. But he wrote this book called Croxton's Raid that my first copy is torn apart, so I've had to buy a second copy. I used it so much. But the other is Dr. William Stanley Hoole's little booklet called The Yankee Invasion of West Alabama. Most everybody's probably familiar with that. And so using those sources and then looking at the maps, and I began to look into original and primary sources of what the official records, reports, and that sort of thing, and began to accumulate, compile service records of soldiers that were involved, began to accumulate letters and diaries from officers and soldiers that were involved, and it really came out with a little bit different perspective than Miller or Dr. Hoole had published them. And about 12 years ago, I published an article on that in the Alabama Review. But recently, there was some material that I wanted to add to that, to have in that article that I wasn't able to add, and that's on the company that General Croxton had dispatched to go into the middle of Pickens County. And that involved the burning of the courthouse, and later on they had a skirmish with basically the home guards, the militia of Pickens County, that really changed the way a lot of those, several men, as we'll see, changed the lives of several men. So as an introduction, I'll just assume, first of all, that everybody in this room knows everything about the Civil War up until the middle of March 1865. But as we all know, early April of 1865 was a tumultuous time for the waning life of the Confederacy. On April 6th in West Alabama, the Federal Brigade of Brigadier General John Thomas Croxton was attacked by the Federal command of William Wirt Adams, who was a Brigadier General in the Confederate Army, commanding Confederate cavalry on the southern border of Pickens County. That was the subject of my first article. A detachment of Croxton's force then had entered the county and into the county seat of Carrollton the same afternoon that Croxton and Adams were fighting, and burned the 1831 courthouse and a Confederate commissary in the area, and really 2 blocks away from the courthouse. And the background of this is in March 1865, General George Thomas, who was commanding the Army of the Cumberland in Tennessee, directed Major General James Harrison Wilson. It's an interesting thing that Wilson was 28 years old at the time, to lead 13,500 cavalrymen along with two batteries of artillery and 250 supply wagons on a raid deep into Alabama, and the object was to reach Selma, destroy the Confederate military-industrial complex in Selma. And secondarily, Wilson was to interact with or help out the actions against Mobile by Major General Edward Canby, although as history shows, Wilson didn't turn south, but actually turned west and went into Georgia. So on March the 22nd, 1865, Wilson led his force, his corps of 3 divisions of Federal cavalry from Gravely Springs, Alabama, which is on the Tennessee River in northwest Alabama, to the heart of the state. And on March the 30th, 1865, Wilson's corps had reached Elleton, Alabama, which right now is in the middle of Birmingham. So Birmingham basically grew up around Elleton, which was at that time the county seat of Jefferson County. And Wilson ordered Brigadier General Edward McCook, who commanded his 1st Division, to detach a brigade to go to Tuscaloosa and destroy the military school, which is now the University of Alabama, and several manufacturing facilities there. So McCook chose Brigadier General John Thomas Croxton, who was himself 27 years old at the time. These guys were young men in charge of huge forces, to undertake this mission. Croxton's force, of course, crossed the Warrior River on April the 2nd. After they fought a battle east of Tuscaloosa on April the 1st, they crossed the Warrior on the 2nd of April, about 40 miles upstream from Tuscaloosa, marched south through Tuscaloosa County, and came into to Northport on the evening of April the 3rd. And around midnight, or just between 10 o'clock and midnight, they assaulted across the covered bridge connecting Northport and Tuscaloosa, and gained control of the town. So by midnight, they had taken control of Tuscaloosa. That afternoon of April the 4th, Croxton sent a detachment of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry to the University of Alabama. Of course, they burned all but the observatory and what's the other house there? Oh, that's a story in itself. They spared the president's mansion. But the next day, on April the 5th, 1865, Croxton left Tuscaloosa, crossed back over into Northport, and burned the bridge. And so Croxton proceeded toward Columbus, Mississippi, on the in Tuscaloosa, proceeded on the upper Columbus Road. Basically, there were 3 roads leading from Tuscaloosa to Columbus, Mississippi. One was the upper Columbus Road, one was the Sipsey Turnpike, and the other was a lower Columbus Road, which actually came into Pickens County and intersected with the Selma Columbus Road, which is a all-weather macadamized road, which was easier to travel. But Croxton decided to go out, and by the time he got to the 7th mile marker, he dispatched a company of the 6th Michigan Cavalry, the 6th Kentucky Cavalry, and put it under the command of Captain William Sullivan to continue on up the Upper Columbus Road toward Columbus to give the Confederate forces the idea that Croxton was continuing on toward Columbus. And of course, Croxton continued, turned south onto the Lower Columbus Road and to get into Pickens County through crossing King's Bridge, which is another story in itself. So Captain Sullivan and the 25 officers and men of Company D of the 6th Kentucky Cavalry proceeded on the Upper Columbus Road till they got to the Shirley Bridge, crossed there, and a little past the Shirley Bridge, they got to the second courier post on this road. This was a courier route that was set up between Columbus and Tuscaloosa. The courier posts were 10 miles apart. And I guess the first courier post they got to was probably abandoned. But they got to the second courier post, and there were 2 Confederate couriers there. They captured them. And they found out, Captain Sullivan found out from those 2 couriers that there were no Confederate forces in Columbus. And in fact, Ward Adams, Brigadier General Ward Adams, had evacuated Columbus that morning. So so Sullivan's company continued, went through Gordo. Nothing happened in Gordo, and at this point he had a choice really of trying to proceed directly south to Carrollton or going a roundabout way. Because several days before this, there had been just tremendous rains. Every one of the rivers and streams was terribly flooded. And in fact, when Croxton crossed the bridge in Tuscaloosa, it was 30 feet above the normal stage. So it was everything was flooding. Trying to go from Gordo to Carrollton would require him to go across all these creeks right here, which would be flooded, would tremendously impede his movement. Croxton had ordered Sullivan to go through the middle of the county and meet up with him on the Tombigbee River at Jones Bluff, which is just south of Utah. So that was where Sullivan was under orders to meet up with Croxton's force. But by the time they got to, so Sullivan decided to go west from Gordo, as best I can determine, to cross over the Lubbock Creek. Okay, there we go. Just above Carrollton. But about late afternoon of April the 5th, they hadn't quite gotten to Lubbock Creek, and so Sullivan decided to camp there that night and cross the next morning. So they had marched 28 miles on their own through Pickens County since the time they were dispatched from Croxton's force. And that night, or that evening, a foraging party left the Federals' camp in this area right here and came from the nearby farm of George A. Cox. Cox and George and Matilda Cox had lived in this area for several years. Cox had gotten property in this area in 1858 and raised his family there. According to the Cox family oral history, though, the 25-year-old Martha Carolyn Cox, the eldest daughter, was busy caring for her father, who was not a young man, and her husband, Jordan Perry Cox, and her brother, Albert Cox. Her brother and her husband, I think her husband was, I think like third or fourth cousin, so they were not closely related, but they carried the same name. Both Jordan and Albert had been in Confederate service. Both of them had been wounded. And were on furlough from the Confederate Army. So Martha was probably pretty concerned that when these Federal soldiers came to her house about the safety of her husband and her brother. But she watched the Yankees raid the farm. They took the chickens and the hogs, cleaned out the smokehouse, cleaned out the spring house. But they didn't destroy anything and didn't come inside the house itself. But after they left, and later that evening, a single Union soldier returned to the house, and he was evidently intent on further plunder. When he threatened to come inside the house, Martha took down the old rifle that they had in the house and loaded it up and threatened to fire on him if he came any further. Well, he wouldn't listen to her, and she shouldered the musket and fired at him and killed the man right there. So she had to defend her home in the dark from these Federal raiders. So she and two of the slaves at the home pulled the man out of the away from took him to where they could hide the evidence, because they knew that the rest of the Federal company would be looking for him later. So Captain Sullivan, the next morning on April the 6th, Captain Sullivan and his company mounted up, and they had their two prisoners, and they found out that one of their comrades was missing. So they sent out details to try to find the missing soldier. And one party of the Union cavalry came to the Cox house to look for the soldier, but they were satisfied with Martha's demand or denials of any knowledge of their comrade, and so the soldiers left the Cox family alone. So when they didn't find the missing trooper, the search details returned to the camp, and they broke camp and saddled up and continued on their mission. But Martha and the two slaves at the house buried the Yankee soldier in their garden. So there's a Union soldier buried somewhere on the other side of Lubbock Creek from Stansel, out in Gulf States woods. So Captain Sutherland and his remaining company came down the road, came south toward Carrollton, which I guess is sort of parallels or at least follows the course of present-day Highway 17 from Reform. And at some point, though, I would suspect a huge rainstorm began developing and probably began raining on them before they got to Carrollton. And that probably hid their, or at least prevented the Confederate scout post, which Wirt Adams had placed in Carrollton, from recognizing their approach. So Captain James Rogers, who was the commander of Company D, led his company down into the streets and charged down the streets of Carrollton and took control of the town. They surprised the scout post and captured 9 Confederate scouts. So they already had 2 Confederate prisoners. Now they had 9 more. And when the Kentucky cavalry began to surround the town and began to take control of the town, the citizens and probably some of the men who were home guards began to fire on them. And this pretty upset Captain Sullivan to no end. Sullivan interrogated his Confederate prisoners and learned that Adams and Croxton had been fighting for most of the day. And in fact, on April 6, 1865, Croxton and Adams were fighting from about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning all the way till 8 o'clock in the evening. So they were fighting most of the day. Sullivan's force, Company D, probably came into Carrollton about mid-afternoon here, considering that they had spent most of the morning looking for their lost comrade, and that they had been rained on the way there. So Sullivan ordered the burning of the courthouse in Carrollton that had been built in 1831, and the destruction of the Confederate commissary, which is about 2 blocks to the east of the courthouse. And the Home Guards realized that the Yankee cavalrymen since they were carrying Spencer carbines, had too much firepower for them within the urban warfare or the urban situation where they found in Carrollton. So they evacuated Carrollton and went south. And the Federal detachment then continued south toward Bridgeville on what is now what we now know as the Old Carrollton Road. Highway 17 didn't exist then. So, and this entire, the distance from Carrollton, of course, you know, if you've ever ridden on the Old Carrollton Road, you know, it goes up and down hills. There's about 15 or 20 hills and ridges that it goes over. So at every hill, the Home Guards would attack them and try to stop the progress of the Union company. And so they would have a firefight, and they began to accumulate more and more Confederate prisoners as the Home Guards tried to attack them. And by the time they got to Franconia, they had accumulated 37 prisoners. So they had more prisoners than there were in the Federal company. But the prisoners that Sullivan captured in Franconia convinced him that Wirt Adams' entire Confederate force occupied Bridgeville, which is down here on Love Oak Creek, south of here from Aliceville. Of course, Aliceville didn't exist then either. So instead of continuing on toward Bridgeville, Sullivan decided to countermarch, to turn around, go back up to Union Chapel, and catch the Bonner Mill Road from here, and go back over to King's Store at Pleasant Grove. Now he knew, or evidently had been informed by Croxton, that was the intention of the brigade to camp at King's Store on the night of April the 5th. So he knew that they had been there, and hoped that he could get in touch with the Union Brigade. So you're talking about a group of about 60 men on horseback riding through muddy roads. Every one of these streams here was flooded. So and then by the time they got across Sneed's Creek here, there's a lot of hills and ridges, and again riding up muddy roads. These guys were exhausted by the time they got to the King's Store site right here in Pleasant Grove, probably well after dark. Apparently at King's Store, a courier from Croxton, General Croxton, caught up with Captain Sullivan and informed him that that Croxton had indeed been attacked by the Confederate force of Wirt Adams, and that Croxton had been driven away from his intended line of march toward Utah. The courier probably delivered a dispatch, probably indicated Croxton's new objective of returning to Northport in this direction here. So, and that Croxton would be camping in Romulus that night. So it's likely the captain believed that Adams' force of 1,500 Confederate cavalry were still in Bridgeville, and thought that the next morning he and his prisoners could just cross at King's Bridge here and march up to Romulus and meet with meet back with the brigade and get back with their comrades, with Croxton's command. So the next morning he could get his little force out of hostile territory. But April the 7th, 1865 was a clear and warm day. There wasn't any rain that day, but of course all the hills and all the trees were just as wet as they could be. But Captain Sullivan's detachment started to cook their breakfast. Of course, they had flour, and they had cornmeal, and they had bacon from the commissary in Carrollton, and probably had some left over they got from the Cox house. And they had the night before they had two prisoners try to escape. One of them had shot, and the other one had gotten away completely. So they were kind of on edge about some of their prisoners getting away. And so they had to keep a close eye on the 35 prisoners they still had. So as soon as they finished their breakfast, Captain Sullivan got them to saddle their horses and get ready to leave so they could rejoin the Federal Brigade in Romulus. So Private Albert Dean was a member of Company D, was saddling his horse, although his right arm was weakened when he had been shot in the elbow in Lafayette, Georgia. Well, I think that's Lafayette, Georgia. It's a proper pronunciation. 10 months ago, the 6th Kentucky Cavalry had fought a real bitter skirmish with Confederate cavalry at Lafayette. But that had, excuse me, that had been 7 months after the 6-foot half-inch Albert Dean had joined the Union cavalry. He was actually from Russell County, Virginia, and he had crossed the mountains and gone into Kentucky to join the Union forces. His father, who was a Confederate sympathizer, and a couple of his uncles had enlisted earlier in the 50th Virginia Infantry. So, talking about brother against brother, families being separated or being at odds, this was certainly the case here. So the buckshot that was lodged in Albert's forearm was where his biceps muscles attached to his arm, and lifting things was kind of painful, but he was still able to saddle his horse. And he was also able to work the action of the Spencer carbine, which is a whole lot better than the Ballard carbine that they'd been carrying 3 weeks before when they turned those in for the Spencer carbines. One of General Wilson's objectives was to arm the Union cavalry completely with the repeating Spencer carbine, which is a carbine that had a magazine that fed into the it fed into the buttstock, and they would hold 7 cartridges, metallic cartridges that were rimfire cartridges, and could be and it was they were loaded by lever action. Now, it wasn't like the rifleman. You couldn't fire it that fast because you had to cock it every time you fired a shot. But it was certainly a lot better than a muzzle loader. Well, they had turned the Ballard carbines in for the Spencer carbines about 3 weeks before they left on the raid into Alabama. So he had missed the combat a week before east of Tuscaloosa because Company D had not been involved in the fight at Tryon. But this afternoon before was the only time he'd ever used the Spencer carbine in combat. So he probably thought he heard a command to fire about the time he was trying to mount his horse, and he heard a dozen rifles and shotguns go off. He turned to see about the Southern Home Guards appearing out of the gun smoke, and in the stillness of the morning, and within seconds another volley rent the air. It was a shotgun blast mingled with the screams of the militiamen. And Dean pulled his 240 pounds into the saddle and instinctively pulled his revolver, holding it up so he could get ready to take care of any sort of threat that might be there. But a gunshot close behind Dean caused his horse to shudder. And instantly a searing pain in his right knee made him drop his revolver and fight to keep his horse up, keep his horse steady. Dean's horse collapsed beneath him and pinned his leg underneath its weight, and then his dying horse rolled up on its back and crushed its rider beneath it. So he's trapping Albert beneath 1,000 pounds of horse, pressing the sharp pommel of the McClellan saddle into his abdomen. And then on top of that, warmth flooded over his face and his chest when the blood from the horse's fatal chest wound poured all over him. So Dean's comrades struggled under fire to pull the dying animal off of him and move their comrade to safety. So not only had his knee been shot and shattered, but when his horse rolled up on top of him, it caused a hernia in his abdomen. So it tore his stomach. And when his horse fell on top of him. And then all the blood from the horse's fatal chest wound, because what happened is the really point-blank gunshot had gone through the horse's chest and then into his knee on the opposite side. And so Albert basically was just covered with blood, and his comrades thought he had a fatal wound as well. So Captain Sullivan got his troops mounted, and they left Albert Dean laying on the ground there, along with another trooper who'd been captured, and they retreated quickly from King's Store, which is right here, down the road here toward King's Bridge, which they thought was their way to safety. Albert Dean, though, was looking for shelter to try to get away from the home guards, from the militiamen, and he crawled up. He found a farmhouse right across the road from King's Store. I don't know if you can see that too well here, but there is I've indicated that on the map. That's the King Bailey house. And at that time, 64-year-old Martha Bonner King was struggling to keep what was left of her family together. Her husband, Williamson King, had died about 20 years before when he fell from a scaffold during building construction, probably while they were building the two-story King Store across the road. And of their 6 children, only one daughter, Lucy, lived with Martha and her brother-in-law, Joseph King, at the time. Now, Joseph was has been described as a profane, lisping, hair-lipped bachelor, but he worked as a grocer in King's Store, and he also operated the grist mill, which was on Sipsey, just right adjacent to King's Bridge, about a mile and a half from the store. So all 3 of Martha's sons had enlisted in the Confederate Army in Thomas Lanier's company of the 42nd Alabama Infantry. John and Joseph were missing and presumed killed in action at the Battle of Corinth, Mississippi in October of 1862. Samuel, the oldest, had been with the Army in September 1864, but he had not been heard from since. So she didn't know where her sons were at the time. And then 2 nights before, the 1,500 troopers of the entire brigade of Croxton's command had camped at King's Store, along with their mule train and their baggage wagon and their ambulances. And then they had looted the store, and they also cleaned out the family's smokehouse. And the following morning and through the afternoon, sounds of battle had broken out to the south around Semmes Mills, which was the fight between Adams and Croxton, and later on across the Semmes at King's Bridge. And then after that, there was this torrential thunderstorm that took place. Actually, during the battle, there was a terrible thunderstorm that took place that lasted into the night. And then that night, Sullivan's detachment arrived at King's Store while it was still raining. And then once more, the Fords and Union cavalrymen came to their house to try to get more commissary items, try to get more food from them, and they just didn't have anything left. So the Kings had really suffered for the last 3 days. So that evening, after Albert Dean had crawled up under the house and hidden behind the chimney, the base of the chimney on the north side of the house, of the King Bailey house, Martha probably heard the groans from under the house when she discovered the injured Albert Dean. Dean begged to be protected, afraid that the home guards would surely kill him when they found him. Later the next morning, the Pickens County militiamen did come to the house looking for the wounded cavalryman. They searched the house and even fired a shot through the floor of the kitchen, but they did not find Albert Dean hiding under the chimney. So after the militia had left, a member of the King family cut a small hole in the floorboards about 2 feet from the fireplace, and for several days they passed food and water to Albert Dean underneath the foundations of the house. Later on, they dragged him out from under the house, from its hiding place over the chimney base, and brought him into the front bedroom and nursed him there for several months. In November of 1865, Albert Dean was finally transported to the Federal Hospital in Columbus, Mississippi, and later on sent to Vicksburg. In a New Orleans military hospital, doctors operated on Dean's shattered right knee to remove diseased bone and other infected tissue. So in summary, the Pickens County Home Guards had driven Sullivan's force from their camp at King's Store and caused the Federal detachment to abandon their prisoners. They lost all their prisoners that they had in hand that they were holding in the store building. And they mounted up and they galloped the mile and a half from King's Store to King's Bridge on Semmes River. And when they got there, of course, Sullivan and his men thought they were going to be able to escape across the bridge and go from the bridge here and get back up to Romulus, which is where the 1st Brigade under General Croxton was located. But when they got to the bridge, they were probably met with Confederate guards at the bridge, and they could probably even see across the bridge, in the road across the bridge, Confederate cavalry was marching south away from Romulus. So Sullivan had to turn his detachment around to the north and follow the west bank of Semmes River, and they probably crossed again at the Shirley Bridge to return to Decatur in North Alabama, which was under federal control. and they arrived there on April the 11th, 1865. They were 6 days separated from the 1st Brigade. They were alone and unsupported in hostile territory. So a small company of 25 officers and men were on their own for 6 days in hostile territory. The weary Federal detachment arrived in Decatur, and the next day, Captain Sullivan wrote his report. A follow-up here on Albert Dean. Albert Dean survived the episode in Pickens County and returned to Virginia in 1866. Family legend, which is confirmed by his federal pension file and the Census of the United States of 1870, holds that he soon left home in Virginia and moved to Texas, where he settled in Hidalgo County, Texas, and worked as a federal customs agent. The wounds in his knee and the hernia in his groin never healed. He wore a truss support and used a crutch for the rest of his life. The leg wound continually, periodically drained serum with particles of degenerating bone, so the wound, the infection, continued on the rest of his life. He possibly married a Mexican woman named Cristina Castillo, with whom he had a son named William, although there are no marriage records that have survived. Albert Dean died in Edinburgh, Hidalgo County, Texas in 1894 at age 47. And Captain William Sutherland and Company D of the 6th Kentucky Cavalry were able to recuperate in Huntsville after they returned to North Alabama from their ordeal in West Alabama. And by May of 1865, they had rejoined Croxton's brigade in Macon, Georgia. In the aftermath of the Union victory, Sullivan received a promotion to the Major of Volunteers on August the 9th, 1865. In February the 23rd, 1866, William Sullivan earned a regular Army commission of Lieutenant of Infantry, and William was assigned to the 17th U.S. Infantry stationed in Galveston, Texas. That year and the next, he underwent 2 courts-martial, and he just barely missed getting kicked out of the Army. But after that experience, he chose to leave the Army and resigned his commission on July the 19th, 1867. But he did not return to his native Ohio. He remained in Galveston, and later in the year he contracted yellow fever. That fall, while he was not yet fully recovered, he chose to travel to Houston to visit friends, and where he died of the fever on September the 28th, 1867, at age 27. Okay. Martha Cox and her husband Jordan moved to Jefferson County after the war. She died on December the 3rd, 1910, and is buried in the Adger Cemetery in Jefferson County. Martha Bonner King was appointed postmaster of Pleasant Grove Post Office on October the 3rd, 1867. She died in Pickens County on June the 29th, 1883, and is buried in the Mitchell Cemetery in Pleasant Grove. After the war, the Pickens County Courthouse was slowly rebuilt from the surviving masonry walls at an estimated cost of $20,000. Think about how much that was, how hard $20,000 was to get during Reconstruction. More than 10 years after its destruction, on the night of November the 16th, 1876, fire broke out in the newly restored courthouse. And within 2 hours, the entire building was consumed. The source of the fire remained a mystery for over a year. Although arson was generally suspected by the county officials and most of the citizenry of Pickens County. More than a year transpired after the burning in rebuilding the third courthouse to stand on the square in Carrollton. As the structure neared completion in January of 1878, before all the windows were installed and the building had yet been occupied, the culprit was identified. Henry Wells, according to testimony, had entered into the probate office of the second courthouse and had lit several candles. The informer further stated that Wells had expressed his intent to burn down the courthouse. Of course, what took place after this is entirely another story. The windows were installed in the third construction of the courthouse in Carrollton during the same month that Henry Wells died. Supposedly he died of gunshot wounds that he received during his apprehension. Sometime thereafter, a distorted image of a man's face appeared in the lower right pane of the north garret window, which remains to this day. So, I'll finish with the final paragraph of my article. I think this sums this up pretty well. So in the confusing and chaotic times and events of April 1865, the details and dates of what has happened in Pickens County have been lost through brevity of recording and the trauma of events. By bringing together scattered recollections and re-examination of existing reports, we may reach a clearer understanding of how Wilson's raid through Alabama made a small but destructive incursion into a sleepy Alabama county, and a devastated Pickens County family protected and nursed a wounded enemy in their home as the war transitioned into peace. Nice. Thank you. I'll entertain any questions. I think that some of the dates I've given probably contradict some of the some dates that exist on some of the historical markers, and be glad to go into some detail about why that's the case.
Did they ever find the guy's body that the Cox had buried?
Not to my understanding. Robert Cox, who sent me this story, said it was his intention to go on the property if he could get permission and look around, but I don't know if that's ever been found. And the identity of the trooper that Carolyn Cox killed is not really known either, although there's some speculation about that, because at the skirmish at King's Store, Captain Sullivan reports a man captured who was later listed, or at least is listed in his official record, in his compiled service record, as having died on the Sultana. You familiar with the Sultana? Okay, on April the 27th, 1865, a steamer that with probably 2,500 passengers, most a Mississippi riverboat with 2,500 passengers, most of whom had been prisoners of war at Andersonville and at the prisoner of war camp in Semmes, exploded on the river north of Memphis. And there were probably close to 2,000 casualties. Probably 2,000 people died from that event. And so this man that may have been the one shot by Carolyn Cox was reported by Captain Sullivan as being captured by Confederate forces at King's Store. But I don't know that for sure. Yes, sir.
Do you have any knowledge of the King's house? Was it sold to Martin? Because I know the Bailey married Martin girl. That's called the Bailey house.
Okay, I was hoping my Bailey expert would be here, but she's not here this evening. But
you know, you can still see where they fed that guy on the floor. I think you saw that.
Yeah, I left that part out. They dug it. They did tear a hole in the floor so they could pass food and water to him under the house. And of course, that's been repaired. But you can still see where that is. The King Bailey house still stands in Pleasant Grove. And you can see the chimney that Albert Dean hid behind to hide from the Pickens County Home Guards. And
I believe the owners of it are in the Birmingham or Bessemer area.
maybe so. The last time I talked to
My first cousin owns it.
oh, okay. Is he in Birmingham?
Davis is.
He's dead, his wife is survived, it's really hurt us.
Okay. So it's still in the Bailey family. Yeah, one of the King descendants married into the Bailey family, and so it's passed from the Kings to the Baileys now.
King's store in close proximity to where Mr. Powell's store used to be.
I think Mr. Powell's store is a little further up the road, a couple of miles, I believe. Yeah, King's store is right at this. Get oriented here.
It was right, Scott, it was right in the middle of where the Fire Tower Road is now.
Yeah.
Peter Allen recently passed away, and he knows it's got 96.
Yeah.
It's
There's a
that store.
huge. This right here is a huge hill. That and this the fire tower he's talking about is right on here, right there, just down the road from King's store, or where King's store was. And for a while, the King's store was the polling place for this area. For a short time, it was actually the post office too for this area. So it was built in the 1840s. And that's when Williamson King apparently fell from a scaffold and died, possibly while they were building that store. Yes, ma'am.
Where would they have put printing presses? Because I have I believe it's an April 5th, 1865 newspaper from Pickens something or another. Did they still print newspapers?
Very few newspapers were in print at that time. Very few newspapers were in print.
But, well, why didn't they burn down the newsstand? I mean, why did they let some places not get burned or destroyed?
Well, of course, the Confederate commissary was a legitimate military target. So they burned it. And apparently, from the sources I've seen, Captain Sullivan burned the courthouse out of spite toward the the Pickens County Home Guards. Of course, that year before, General Sherman had set the precedent for destroying courthouses when he marched through Georgia, and he was doing the same thing in South Carolina and North Carolina at this very time. So that was a kind of standard practice. I've read accounts of where they, instead of burning the courthouse, they would bring the land records out and pile them out into the street and set fire to them there. Because destroying the property records was the objective in many of these cases. Yes, sir.
Scott, wasn't there a skirmish at Lanier's Mill on the Semmes River? And about what time did that occur?
Okay, you're talking about the skirmishing, which is sort of a running cavalry fight between Wirt Adams and Croxton's brigade, and that took place on the opposite side of Semmes on April the 6th, 1865. And I'll speak toward this. The Semmes Mills and Lanier's Mill are one and the same. Okay. Here, this is where it's located, and in the 1860 census, it's listed as Jordan's and Lanier's Lanier's and Jordan's Sipsey Mills. Yeah, I have it as Lanier's and Jordan's Sipsey Mills, which is exactly how it's listed in the 1860 census in Schedule 3. That was owned by Thomas Lanier, who was a captain of Company D of the 42nd Alabama Infantry, and William B. Jordan, who was who had lots of property in this area right here. And William B. Jordan also had a smaller mill that was located just across, or not far from Benavola. And I think what I believe the confusion of these sites has come from James Clanahan's book on the history of Pickens County. Okay, he has a little map in there that shows his speculations about these movements and all, and the location of them. And he shows Lanier's Mill and Sipsey Mills as two separate sites. Okay, in 1855, there was a map of Alabama published by, I can't think of the man's name now. There was a map of Alabama published which showed Lanier's Mill as being in this location right here near Benavola, instead of Lanier's and Jordan's Sipsey Mills down here. So I think the confusion, and the map even shows some other inaccuracies, but I think that Lanier's Mill was probably the location of William B. Jordan's mill, which is a smaller mill located further up Sipsey near Benavola. Now I've tried to get to that location, and the one or two times I've tried, I haven't been able to get where I think it was located because the water was too high. But you can see the ruins of Sipsey Mills here. Evidently, the mill was first built in the 1850s by Thomas B. Jordan and by Thomas Lanier as a three-runner grist mill. That is, it had three sets of grinding stones. And that's the structure that the Union Brigade burned on April the 6th, 1865. And then sometime in the late 1860s, early 1870s, it was rebuilt and expanded as a five-runner mill, because there's an advertisement in a Pickens County newspaper that Lanier's Mill, or Sipsey Mills, is referred to as Sipsey Mills in that advertisement, has reopened, and it's a five-runner grist mill. That is, has five sets of grindstones. So what they would do is they would grind corn and wheat separately, and they could it was like 15,000 bushels a year of each of those would go through that mill. Yes, ma'am.
Where is Mitchell Cemetery?
Mitchell Cemetery, let's see, it's probably about right here. I know it's between Benavola and Pleasant Road, and it's on the east side of the road. It's between the road and it's just east of the road, but between there and the river. Yes, sir.
Didn't Pickens County have some stagecoach inns, and I was wondering if they use stagecoach trails to travel?
Well, there were, of course, this route right here, which goes through Pleasant Ridge and Bridgeville, was the Selma Columbus Stage Road, and it was exceedingly improved road. It was macadamized, macadamization was a process where they built the road up in several layers, and so it would be an all-weather road. It would drain well. It would, and so a major stage road ran through here. Now there was also a stage road that ran between Utah and Carrollton that went through Hinton's Grove, crossed Mississippi about right here in a ford. Okay, there wasn't a bridge there, and then continued up toward Carrollton from there.
So I can't imagine them going through that swampy area you were describing earlier.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's only a few places here where a real good ford is possible, or the ability to reach the river to ford the river is surrounded by swamp, as you can see here. And really, you know, Highway 14 goes just straight like this. Well, at that time, there was not a good bridge here. There was a ferry called Carpenters Ferry at this location where the Highway 14 bridge is now. Actually, the stage road turned right at Pleasant Ridge, went to Semmes Mills, and then looped back around to Cochran's Mills, which is at this intersection here, just east of the Old Bethany Church, and then turned right and went back up through Bridgeville and on to Columbus. So when you start looking at these roads and compare them with the modern roads and where you're looking at the old maps, and you realize that as transportation improved and road speeds improved or increased, that these road routes were changed dramatically. So, you know, where a road is now is not where it was in 1865. Well, a little bit about the dates. I know the date of the burning of the courthouse that appears on the historical marker in Carrollton says April the 5th, 1865. But in reality, the courthouse was burned on April the 6th. Also, the marker at King's Store that commemorates the King's Store skirmish says that it occurred on April the 6th, 1865. But in reality, the Home Guards attacked Captain Sullivan's company on the morning of April the 7th, 1865. I'm sorry?
Wait. I'm so sorry. So what did you have to do to research those new dates?
I'm about to tell you right now.
Okay.
Okay, so in reading Captain Sullivan's report, Captain Sullivan wrote this report the day after he got back to Decatur. So this was after he had spent 6 days of fighting and harassment and struggling to get his command out of hostile territory. And I won't read the whole thing, but you'll notice, and you got to realize something about how the official records were compiled. Okay, realize that they had to take all these handwritten records, handwritten reports, and transcribe them and set the type so they could print the printed official records. The official records of the Union Confederate armies, called the Army of the Records of the Rebellion. There's a 128-volume set of these records, and they took every one of these handwritten reports and put them in order, and the transcribers had to read each one of them and see. They also were careful to compare it with other reports of the same or similar circumstances or events. So Captain Sullivan says on the morning of the 4th of April, the command moved out of Tuscaloosa. Well, General Cox's report says that they moved out of Tuscaloosa on the 5th. So the transcribers have placed instead beside where Sullivan says the 4th, they put in parentheses the 5th. Okay, and then couple other instances too, where another report has mentioned the same event. The transcribers have changed the report that, or added into Captain Sullivan's report the actual date in parentheses. So the bottom line is that Captain Sullivan's report is a day off in every day that he mentions. Okay? Also, Captain Sullivan doesn't say when one day ended and another day began either, too. So it's kind of hard to know where this is taking place. So in reading the report, it would seem that that the burning of the courthouse takes place on the 5th. Let's see here. In Carrollton, Captain Rogers charged gallantly into town, capturing 9 of General Ward Adams' scouts. There I ascertained that severe fighting had been going on all day between General Croxton and General Adams. Well, those events were taking place on the 6th of April. So the day that Sullivan came into Carrollton had to be on the 6th of April, because he was told about the Confederate scouts that he captured that Adams and Croxton had been fighting all day long. So the assumption that Sullivan came into Carrollton and burned the courthouse on the 5th conflicts with what the report actually says.
We got a little bit of food we need to
Got some food we need to eat?
get. Yeah.
All right, well, everybody remember that. Okay, so he says here, while at King's Store on the 6th, we were attacked by forces from Carrollton and Bridgeville and compelled to abandon our prisoners. Well, first of all, we've seen where Captain Sullivan's report is a day off, reports a day early, then events actually took place. Also, Albert Dean's compiled service record and his pension file state that he was wounded on April the 7th, 1865. So the fact that Sullivan's report is a day off and every date that he gives, and that Albert Dean's records show that he was wounded on the 7th, indicates that the battle at King's Store took place on the 7th of April. Yes, sir.
Is this map available online?
Actually, this map is not available online. If you want a copy of it, give me your. I'll give you my email address and I'll send one to you. Yeah, this map was the way I generated this map is I actually had software that a map software that took the 1982 USGS maps that are mosaic together, and then I traced the 1865 routes as best as I could figure out from older maps, and also I discovered that in those 1982 USGS maps, where it shows trails that going through the woods is where the old main routes used to be. So using older maps and where those trails were are located on the modern maps or the later 20th century maps, and kind of gauge where the 1865 routes were. So I traced those, and then I printed that map and just took a plain piece of paper and traced where all the rivers go, where all the extent of the swamps, and also the road routes, and made a copy of that. So the rivers that are shown on here, the swamps that are shown on here are exactly accurate according to modern maps. And the roads are retraced from research that I've done on older maps and other indications from older routes. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.